Thank you very much. I'm just so honored to be here. And this is my fourth visit to Blackfeet Nation. And I can remember the first time that I came here, I felt this strange stirring, like there were people here that I knew, although I didn't know that I know them. And it was only at this visit that I learned that there are Jarvises right here on your territory. And there's only one Gervais clan descended from one Gervais or Jarvis settler in Quebec. So I think that the Creator was stirring me and reminding me that in some ways this is a home, and that I am very blessed that both on the French side of my family and on the Mohawk side of my family, I have reason to be in this community and reason to consider this community sort of a place where I have family. Natalie, are you going to control the slides? Yes. Okay, so turn, next slide then. Oh, I want to also acknowledge the fact that some of the work I'm going to describe today is done by one of my brilliant young indigenous proteges, a young woman named Megan Criswell, who's from the Oklahoma Band of Cherokees and now an MD PhD student at the University of Colorado. And I think that one of the things that I've tried to do throughout my career is find really motivated indigenous students with good hearts and find good work for them to do. I just found a job for Andrea just while visiting here. So look out, if you're an indigenous student, I'm probably going to find work for you. So I want to say thank you to you all for welcoming me once again to your territory, and thank you for the hospitality I always receive when I come to your community. Next slide. So now I need to give you a little lesson about the indigenous peoples of New York, because we're still there. Like the Blackfeet Nation, the white people tried to get rid of us. And I'm going to apologize because we encountered Henry Hudson in 1609. And if we had stopped him there, if we had just put our foot down then, maybe this whole mess wouldn't have happened. But no, we had to actually trade with them, and we actually had to help them. What were we thinking? I don't know. But anyway, from east to west, we are. If you look up on the Canadian border there, that's where Akwesasne is. The Catholics are responsible for getting us up there because we used to be around the Albany region. That was our territory, Albany and western Connecticut and Massachusetts. But from east, so we, the Mohawks, are the keepers of the Eastern Gate. And as I say, we kind of let everybody down on that job. Next, the Oneidas in central New York, the Onondagas, who are our fire keepers, and where we gather for ceremonies. Next, Cayuga, who don't have a land base in New York yet, but are working to get their land back. And finally, Seneca Nation over in the west in Buffalo, where I currently live. There are also indigenous people on Long Island, so we're still there. We're still kind of in our traditional lands, and we're still dealing with many of the same issues as you're dealing with in this community. Next slide, please. So I'm just here, wait a minute. Go back, can you, for a minute, Natalie? Okay, I can tell I'm not dealing with a pediatric audience, because see, I give this talk a lot to people in pediatrics and child health, and when they see pictures of indigenous children, like the one I just showed, everybody goes, oh, because I have to admit, this is where my passion is making sure that indigenous children never have to live the lives that many of you in this room have lived. So let's try this again. Next slide, please, Natalie. Oh, I mean, how can you resist that? And do you see all of that hope and all of that potential and all of that just beauty of the Creator shining through those children? And that is why I do what I do, that right there. So here's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to talk a little bit about health inequities. Notice I didn't say health disparities, because I really believe that the health problems of our indigenous people did not occur just by accident. Surprise! Right? That they are the result of deliberate policies that decide who has resources and who doesn't. They're not just something that happened. So for example, if you go down to Oklahoma, an oil millionaire pays less tax on her stock dividends than a Cherokee family living in a trailer in Peggs, Oklahoma, pays for their food. A Cherokee family living in Oklahoma has to pay more tax on their food than the oil millionaire does on her stock dividends. That is why, that's public policy, and it has a direct effect on health. I'm next going to talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is a really important study that allows us to understand an awful lot about the boarding school experience, but things that have happened to children since. And finally, I'm going to talk about, because I'm a physician, I want to talk a little bit about the biology of that. And I'm also going to talk about another aspect that has contributed to health, which is the tremendous diet change that occurred when people went from living their traditional cultures to living, can I say this out loud, to living a culture that was intended to kill them. Is that okay to say that? I hope. Okay. Next. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about rheumatic diseases, because this is something you may not think about, but it's also the illnesses I take care of. So I'm going to use this as an example because I try to talk about things I know about. All right, which makes me different from a lot of politicians, I guess. Next slide. Oh, that's not my students, oh my God. So, all right, I won't do that. Okay, those are two really cool people in that picture I just showed. Next. Okay, so one of the illnesses I'm going to talk about is systemic lupus. And systemic lupus is an illness that's much more common in indigenous people, as I'll show you in a minute. And it's an illness where the immune system attacks our own bodies. And that the attack of the immune system on the body can occur in almost any tissue. Next slide, please. So a lot of the injury occurs to inflammation in the blood vessels, including the kidney, where there's lots of blood vessels. And the top picture is the picture of a kidney that it's a microscopic view of a kidney that is affected by lupus. And you can see when you compare it to the lower slide how abnormal that kidney filtering apparatus looks. Next slide. And as I said, lupus can affect any organ system in the body. Any organ system in the body can become inflamed, including the joints and muscles. Next. The other illness I'm going to talk about ever so briefly is rheumatoid arthritis. This is an illness that affects the joints primarily. And next slide. You can think of this as a tumor of the joint lining, where immune cells get into the joint, and then the joint lining begins growing, just like a tumor, and the joint begins to be destroyed, as I'm showing in this picture. Next. So if you look at systemic lupus, for example, indigenous Americans are twice as likely to have lupus as the broader population. Now, if you read in the textbooks, they'll tell you that the highest incidence of lupus are in African American people. And that's just not true. And I know you're going to be shocked to hear this. There are a lot of things about indigenous people in textbooks that aren't true. Who knew? But that's one of them. In fact, one of the problems with medical textbooks is that they're written by white people, for white people, and about white people. And our students never even learn that there's things they have to consider when they walk into indigenous communities. In fact, I can remember when I gave a lecture at Columbia University a few years back, and I tried to bring out these examples, some of the things I'm telling you all about today. And one of the comments I got from the students afterwards was, "I didn't come here to learn about Indians. I came here to learn about immunology." So I know that it turns out that racism isn't dead. Who knew? Okay, next slide. So these are the rates. This is another chart looking at the rates in American Indian Alaska Native people. Those are the blue bars. And you can see that it's men and women, boys and girls, who are affected by lupus in our community. And again, the rates are twice as high as almost any other population, and about 20% of the people who have lupus are in fact under the age of 18. I cared for a number of young Cherokee adolescents back in the days when I was in Oklahoma with fairly severe systemic lupus. Next slide. Okay, so if you look at, here's actually sort of a textbook picture, but this community, at the last estimate, probably has as high a rate of rheumatoid arthritis as any community in North America. You wouldn't notice it because it's still a fairly rare disease, but it's much more common in our indigenous communities, true for most of the Northern Plains populations, true for many of the Oklahoma populations. The Mohawks and the Six Nations tend to have a lot of lupus, but not quite as much rheumatoid arthritis. Next. Same thing, if you look, back, Natalie, back. Yeah. Oh, no, that was forward. Go back, back. There, okay, now forward. Now forward. There. Oh, I know. Oh my God. So even if you look at juvenile arthritis, we know that the prevalence rate of the most severe form of juvenile arthritis is about twice as high in indigenous people as in the broader population. And I took care of a lot of indigenous kids with juvenile arthritis back when I was seeing patients. Next. I know. So how do we, I know, yes, oh. How do we link these medical facts that appear as dry numbers in a textbook to the lived experience, whether it's our Mohawk communities, whether you're in Seneca Nation, whether you're down in Seminole, whether you're in Oklahoma, or whether you're up here in Montana? We intuitively understand that this experience impacted health. When I first started expressing these ideas, people thought I was nuts, which might also be true, but I think in this respect, we have to honor what happened to our children 3 generations ago, 4 generations ago. Because if we don't understand that, we're not going to understand what I think is the next step. Okay, next slide. By the way, now stay there. One of the things, it's very surprising the number of people in the broader population who don't understand, even know about boarding schools and what happened to indigenous children. So I've spent a lot of time in the last year and a half broadly disseminating the federal government's report on boarding schools, which is a little bit sanitized, but at least is written in language that a lot of people can understand. So we have to, in order to understand that, we have to understand a study that was done by my colleague Vince Felitti in San Diego. And here's the story. By the way, Mohawks love to tell stories. You all are not the only storytellers. So, and also our winters are as long as your winters, so there's a lot of time to tell stories in the Longhouse. So here's a story. Vince ran a obesity clinic in nice suburban San Diego, actually San Diego City. You know, this is a nice middle-class, fairly wealthy community. And he told me that one day he happened to have a patient and he had time, which is something that doctors don't always have. So he just asked her, when did you start gaining weight? And she said, when I'm 12 years old. And he said, well, what happened then? That's when my uncle and my father started sexually abusing me. And the story was that the shame, the anger, the betrayal that she felt when she was being abused, she tried to soothe that by eating, because let's face it, high-fat, high-sugar foods do make the brain feel good. And so she would gain weight, and then her uncle and her father left her alone. But she said that whenever she began to lose weight, she would be terrified. And even as a 40-year-old woman, when she would lose weight, she would be terrified. She couldn't sleep at night. She would walk the floor. She'd lock the doors. So Vince asked himself, is this a one-off? Or is there something that this woman's trying to tell me that I need to listen to? And fortunately, he listened. And what Vince found was that there's a whole series of experiences that children can have that predict a poor health outcome as an adult. And I've listed the experiences here. Many of you know these experiences, but what Vince thought was this was probably had to do with a purely psychological response to the trauma. And at the time that I first met Vince, which was actually at an Indigenous Children's Health meeting, I told him, I said, I think you need to look even deeper into this. Can I have the next slide? So that's what my story is going to be today, is looking more deeply into this. Now, I don't have to tell you that if you score adverse childhood experiences in Indigenous communities, in many cases, they're just off the wall. And this is a study published by my friend and colleague, Don Warren, at University of North Dakota. Don is Oglala Lakota. He has an MD and a master's in public health, and he's been very concerned with this issue for the last 15 years. But Don is just saying what we already knew, which is that the adverse childhood experiences scores for people on the northern plains and in our communities as well are far higher than in the broader population. Let's see the next slide, please. What is interesting is this little study that showed the higher your ACE score, the higher your adverse childhood experiences score, the more likely you were to get systemic lupus. So what does that have to do with a childhood, with psychological responses? We know you do have psychological responses to trauma, but this is an immune system driven illness, we thought. And next slide. And lupus is more severe. The higher your adverse childhood experiences score, the more likely you are to have severe lupus with kidney disease or brain disease or severe intestinal disease or skin disease. The more severe your childhood experiences were, the more traumatized you were as a child, not only are you more likely to get lupus, you're more likely to have severe lupus. Next slide. So this gets us to this topic that I've heard raised here a few times, and that's the topic of epigenetics. I'm going to explain this I'm going to assume that nobody here really understands epigenetics as a geneticist. So let me try to put this as clearly as I can. Next slide. So our DNA, there's our picture of a DNA molecule, is sort of a blueprint that helps the cells make proteins. And there are other parts of the DNA, though, that instruct the DNA about what protein to make and when. Next slide. And those two things that can happen are that the latter part of the DNA can be changed, or the little tails on the proteins that the DNA is wrapped around can change. And we call these epigenetic changes. That is, they change, they're not going to change whether you have blue eyes, they're not going to change whether you're 6'4". They will change how much insulin you make after you have a meal. They will change how much cortisol you make after you've been frightened. They will change whether or not you have sufficient other hormones to bring your insulin levels back down after you've eaten a meal. It'll change all that, and think that this is the kinds of things that we're struggling with in terms of indigenous health. Next slide, please. So basically, you can think of your DNA as sort of like a slinky. Am I the only one old enough to remember the slinky toy? So think of your DNA as like a slinky, and when you, for example, you eat some of the yummy food we've been eating here for 2 days, that your insulin gene, the slinky, opens up, and that allows you to make more insulin, and then when you have made enough insulin, the slinky will close back up. And that's what the epigenome does. It opens or closes the slinky so that you can make the right proteins at the right time. Or if you get exposed to COVID, your slinky will stay open just enough for your immune system to work and then close when you've gotten rid of the virus. But if you have a slinky that's stuck on open, that could be very, very bad for you, because then your immune system keeps going and going and going and going when it shouldn't. Next slide, please. So it turns out that your epigenome can also be determined by your diet. These two mice are genetically identical, but one mouse's mother was fed one diet, and one mouse's mother was fed another diet. So what the mother ate determined whether these mice are obese or not. And if you think about the stories that I've heard of people coming, being herded onto a place like this, a fence put around it, so now you can't hunt. The buffalo are almost gone anyway. So what is there to eat? Well, the government agent shows up with weevily wheat and rancid lard, if they even show up with anything, because many of them have pocketed the money and headed back home. In our case, it was being herded onto places so small that we couldn't hunt anymore, and so a lot of the game meats disappeared from our diets. But it doesn't matter. The mother's diet affects whether or not these mice are obese. Next slide. But it's more than that. And here's an experiment that I find it was Ann Bullock, who's Ojibwe, who alerted me to this experiment. And I'll describe it very quickly. This I would do this differently, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So you have these male mice, and you give these mice something they really like to smell. It's sort of like popcorn or Cinnabon or something like that. But then you shock the mouse. You subject this mouse to trauma. Then you mate the mouse with some females who've never smelled the smell, never felt the trauma, and their pups, when they smell that smell, the pups have never had any of these experiences. When those pups smell that smell, they go cower in the corner of their cage. You do this one more generation. Now you have these mice who haven't smelled the smell and haven't heard the sound. You mate them again, next generation. They smell the smell and they go cower in the corner of their cage. The trauma 2 generations previously is now biologically bred into these mice. I would submit, and I've asked some of my indigenous research friends, that this will happen across 7 generations. Because we know, at least our saying is that what a mother does impacts 7 generations of her children. So next slide. And this just shows that if you look on the right, those are the traumatized mice. Their brains are totally rewired. They're not supposed to look like that. They're supposed to look like the brains on the left. Next slide. And this just shows, you don't have to go into it, that in fact this is an epigenetic change that changes how the cells in the brain develop because of this trauma. Next slide. And we now know that in fact these epigenetic changes can be passed from one generation to another. The trauma of the mother, the trauma of the father is still there 5 generations later. So you may have young people who were forced off the reserve back when they were trying to move everybody in the cities. There may be some young Blackfoot banker sitting in Seattle, but she is still carrying the wounds of her grandparents. Those wounds are still there. So what do? Well, actually there is good news about this, because the epigenome is very, very changeable. All you have to do is be aware that it's there, and the solutions begin presenting themselves. Next slide. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So we know these things, not only do they happen in the brain, they also happen in the immune system. So the trauma, so that the immune changes that make a young girl more prone to getting lupus or juvenile arthritis, those epigenetic changes also affect the immune system. Next. So I'm going to talk a minute about diet change, because we know that also, next slide, here's the diet that we went from, or our people went from corn, beans, squash, game meat. By the way, I never saw a deer that looked better in the woods than it does in a crock pot. I still love game meats. I know they're really yummy. But then you got the canned beef, salty, rancid. You had the weevily wheat, and rancid lard, so you get fry bread and so on and so forth, because that's the only way to make this stuff edible when it's available. The Ponca Nation of Iowa was herded down into Oklahoma in 1868 and promised that there would be shelter and food waiting for them. They arrived on the open prairie in October and found nothing. The Indian agents had taken the money and run, and 2/3 of the Ponca tribe died of exposure in that winter of 1868. So this stuff, not only it changed, but there were periods of starvation as well. We know how to fix this, because the only fix required is going back to our traditional ways of rearing children, of eating, of looking after one another. We know that the only thing we have to do is that. And there's actually good data that show us that. Can I have the next slide? Let's remember that, that 3 generations of children, at least, maybe 4, never had their parents to teach them the good ways of being a mother or a father. What did they learn? What did they learn about how you raise a child? They learned it from the priests and nuns and soldiers. The way you raise a child is you cut her hair, you beat her, you rape her, you tell her that she's been consorting with the devil because she calls the deity the creator. And that's what they learned. They learned to hold a mirror up to themselves and say, I hate you. That's what they learned. And that happened for 4 generations. How in the world does anybody learn to rear a child when they themselves have been subjected to such hideous abuse? And I don't care if you're Mohawk, if you're Seminole, if you're from one of the rancherias outside of Los Angeles, if you're from Red Lake, this has happened to your parents and grandparents. How did they learn to do it? Somehow, by some miracle, some people were able to learn this wisdom of how to raise a child. I don't know how, but they learned it. So we have to learn to grab that, because none of these health problems are going to get better until we grab that, and that we grab taking care of each other. So what is Menominee? So Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, they're a very small tribe, and maybe 15 years ago, they realized the we have to take care of each other parts of it. And what they've done is started what's called a trauma-informed model. They assume that anybody that they deal with has been horribly traumatized or is suffering the biological effects of their grandparents being traumatized. And so every part of their system, their schools, their justice system, their healthcare system, anything that is a community effort makes that assumption. It's called trauma-informed care. The genius behind this is a tribal member named Jerry Wakaw. Jerry was even to convince the off-territory high school to adapt this model. And now Menominee Nation is beginning to see the effects of what healing from trauma is when they adopt their traditional view that we are a community, we care for each other, and if you're hurting, we're all hurting. Next slide. There's another really lovely program that's being run out of the Hopkins School of Native American Health, where they go into communities and they find the elders who know something about traditional child rearing, and they listen to those elders, and then out of that, they train other young people to start caring for young mothers before they give birth. So they teach the traditional ways about how to care for yourself as a young mother and what to expect of your children as they grow. And they do it in the way that fits the remaining fragments of parenting from the traditional culture. And what we've shown is that when you do this, when you care for young mothers, when you teach them to smooch their babies, by the way, the single most powerful medicine in the world is a hug and a smooch and 3 little words, I love you. If you wanna reverse all of the awful things that the soldiers and the government and the priests and the nuns did, smooches and I love you will do most of the work. So Family spirit reminds young mothers that in our traditional cultures, smooches and I love you were an abundant part of child rearing. Next, please. So I like to think now that we have a very complicated thing going on here, but it actually has a fairly simple solution. That the secret to health, I'm going to say this, I'm a doctor, is not doctors. The secret to health in this community, and Akwesasne, and Seneca Nation, and Tonawanda, and Seminole in Florida, the secret is this, that we return to our traditional sense that children are the most important resource in our community because they're our future. And if we don't love our children, we will not have loving communities. So we can talk about the ecology, we can talk about child development. Next, please. Pop that. We can see this complex play with epigenetics next. And biology all interplaying. But the single most important thing is that this complex biology has to be rooted in our understanding that our traditional cultures have always emphasized caring for children and making sure children understood that they are being raised in a community that loves them and values them. Next slide, please. So don't you want this to happen? By the way, Ann Bullock, my Ojibwe friend, gave me, don't we all want this to happen? Look at this little guy. And nobody said, but that's okay. But oh my God, he's looking in the mirror and he's seeing himself as an indigenous child. And he's looking at his uncle or his father or his older brother. And he's saying, I'm like you. Isn't this amazing? I'm an indigenous child. And you love me. And you're showing your love for me by showing your traditional ways. Is there anybody in this room who doesn't want that? And I've spent 40 years of my life trying to get that. And sorry. We can get that. My wife keeps asking me, why aren't you going to retire? That's why, right there. That's why I'm not retired yet. You're probably going to, you might have to bury me in this community when I have my heart attack, but that's okay. This is what we all want. We can get there. It's not that hard. This is a hell of a lot cheaper than building prisons, by the way. I keep telling members of Congress. But, I forgot. The prison systems are now privatized, and the guy who owns the prison system is a buddy of the governor. Silly. I'm sure it's coincidence. Okay, next slide, please. Somebody's got to help me with this. I got this slide from Don Warren. First of all, I'd love to know whether that person there is actually Blackfeet. I'd like to know who that is. And this sounds like words I've heard from Blackfeet people, but if there's some elder who knows who that is or knows where this comes from, I would appreciate knowing. But I think that this, to me, is the essence of what I believe and have worked for. If it's not Blackfeet, I will change that. This slide that comes directly from Dawn, but I'd love to learn about this. But I really believe this, that if you don't know this, you don't know anything worth knowing. So I'm going to say, Nyawet, thank you. And I think we have some times for questions, criticisms, if I'm way out of line. If the United States government gets a hold of this recording, please burn it. All right, thank you very much.
Great. Great friend and mentor.
Thank you. thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. You're the best. Thank you for putting on a great conference.
Thank you.